Hey, everybody, welcome to our next episode of the Extreme Leadership Podcast, where we explore the topics of leadership and team building through the lens of high mountain and polar expeditions. Today, I am super excited to be talking with Billi Bierling, who I first met when we were guiding together in Nepal for a True Patriot Love charity expedition. Billi is high energy, has so many fascinating experiences, personally and professionally. She has personally climbed six of the 8,000-meter peaks, three of them without oxygen, and is curator of the Himalayan Database. Billi's done so many cool things, and I'm so happy she's got some time to spend with us here today on the Extreme Leadership Podcast. So let's get started. Welcome, and thanks for being here, Billi.
Well, thanks, Scott, for having me. I mean, really kind of you to remember me after all those years. So I'm
Yeah,
excited to be on the
and
podcast.
it's great to see you again. Since our spent some time together in the Khumbu Valley a while ago.
Yeah.
So I before we get going into the leadership stuff, let's learn a little bit about Billi. So tell us a bit about your background. How did you start in climbing?
Well, it's always a funny story because I grew up in the Bavarian Alps and
Yeah.
everybody thinks, well, of course, Billy is a climber because she grew up in a place called Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a very long German name. So obviously I'm German. But I didn't. I hated the mountains when I was there because I suppose I was always been a free spirit. And when you live in a place where you are surrounded by mountains, and if you're a free spirit, you want to break out. And I remember, as young teenagers, we used to have the saying, get rid of the mountains, we want a clear view to the Mediterranean. But then, as it happens, so my mother always used to say, oh my God, I hope you once meet a man who loves the mountains. And I said, Mom, I wouldn't even look at him. But, as it happened, I met Mike Rocott, who was my partner of 10 years. He was a climber. I moved to the UK, started climbing in England, Wales, Scotland, beautiful places. And then in 98, Mike and I went to Nepal for the first time. And very quickly did I realize that, in order to climb, I had to walk, because also when we were rock climbing in the UK, to get to the crag, I had to walk. So, one thing led to the other. And the first trip in 98, we were in the mountains for 3 months. Absolutely loved it. It wasn't always easy because, when I was writing my book, I looked back in my diary. And even though I always say, oh, I fell in love with Nepal in 98, there was a lot of moaning there because it's hard, high altitude climbing is hard. And back then we went up to 6,500 meters. And yeah, so that's how I got into mountain climbing.
And I know you do a lot of endurance running and mountain running. Did you start that around that time as well, or did that
Yeah.
come later?
Yeah, I mean, similar. I mean, my dad was a runner, and he was so upset that he had two daughters who were pretty unsporty. I mean, my sister was doing ballet, but I just couldn't. I didn't want to walk. And I remember he would offer us 100 Deutschmarks, which is so much money back then, to go running with him around a lake. And I looked at him and said, "What? Running around this lake? You're crazy." Now, running around the lake for me is a warm up.
Yeah.
But again, 98 in Nepal, after having been to the mountains for 3 months, I came back and I felt so fit. I thought, I don't want to lose this fitness. So I started running. And then, one thing again led to the other. I ran and then did a marathon and another marathon. And yeah, and then I started trail running. And the thing is, I never think I'm very good at it, but I do it and I do it for fun. And, my longest trail run was 102 kilometers. It was in my hometown in Garmisch. And I didn't really think, I just thought, I'm going to try. I'm going to see how far I go. And if I can't do it, I'll stop. There's always a way out. And so I never put any pressure on me. I just want to try out things. I'm incredibly curious.
Yeah.
I'm like my mother. She's 90, and I think she's only lived to 90 and very well because of her curiosity. And I'm always curious. I want to find out, and I try things. And if they don't work out, it's not a failure. So that's how I got into mountain running, and I still do it. I actually do more running now than climbing.
Yeah. And when you were there in Nepal in 98, is that did you meet Elizabeth Hawley at that point, or was that later?
No, not in 98, but in 2001. So
Okay.
Mike, my then partner, he had been obsessed with Everest, the Himalayas, since small child. I had no idea. I had no, so after 98, we went back to Nepal every year. And in 2001, we thought we were going to try a 7,000 meter peak. And that 7,000 meter peak was an expedition peak, which means it is in the Himalayan database, which was set up by that lady you just mentioned, Miss Elizabeth Hawley. Now, Miss Hawley didn't care whether you were Reinhold Messner or whether you were Uli Steg or just two no-names who go and climb an expedition peak, because she wanted to have her information. So just to explain to the listeners, the Himalayan database is a database of more than 450 mountains. And there you can check, who climbed, how did they climb, with oxygen, without Sherpas, and so on and so forth. And Liz Hawley set it up, started it in 1963. It was the first American Everest expedition. And she followed it as a journalist and wrote for Reuters back then. Anyway, one thing led to the other again. And then she just, had followed this expedition, thought, oh, that's really interesting. So she carried on. So when we got there in 2001, Miss Hawley had already, done this work for 40 years. And rang us up in our hotel the second we arrived. It was quite funny because we walked into the hotel, put our bags down, the phone rang. And then the guy at the reception said, oh, Dr. Grokhold, there's a phone call for you. And I thought, oh, that's a bit weird. Who's that? And then I saw Mike, and he was talking, and he was so humble. And then he hung up, and he came up to me and said, guess who's just rung us? And he smiled, and I said, well, who? Miss Elizabeth Hawley. And I looked at him and said, well, who's that? So I had no idea. But for Mike, because she was a legend, so for him, that she rang us, the two no-names who climb at 7,000 meter peak, was just amazing. Whereas for Miss Hawley, as I said, whether it's Reinhold Messner or anybody, she wanted her data.
Yeah.
So then she came and interviewed us. And, she was as stern as she was, and, her skirt up to here. And she just wanted her information and left again. And I just remembered that, in a way, I was really impressed by her, and I thought, why is she doing this? And so this is how I met her. Sorry, that was a long story.
A few years later, you got involved with the Himalayan Database yourself.
Yeah. So basically, Mike and I then split up in 2002. I moved to Switzerland as a radio journalist. And, I'd been thinking about Nepal and just thought, oh, God, I'd love to live there. Because it's always easy to say, oh, it's such a beautiful country when you go there on holiday. And then I remembered that lady, and I thought, well, why don't I just write her a letter? And back in the days, it was really a letter to her post box. I think it's PO Box 284. It was used by all the expats in Kathmandu back in the days. Everybody I meet. Frances Klatzel, she's a Canadian lady who's lived there for many years. She said, oh, my God, I used that post box for years. Anyway, she got the letter in which I asked whether I could work for her. And she wrote back to me saying, yeah, just when you're in Kathmandu, give me a ring and we'll take it from there. And that was in 2004. And I thought I'm going to do it for a season, maybe a year. And now 20 years later, Miss Hawley, unfortunately, is no longer with us. I'm still doing it, and I'm trying to carry on her legacy somehow.
Yeah, amazing. And is that when you got your bike?
That is when I got my bike. It's so funny you should say that, because see, you're referring to my book, which is called I Have a Bike in Kathmandu, only in German at the moment. But for me, a bicycle is paramount to wherever I live. I want to, it's so quick. So I arrived, and the first thing I did was go out and get that bicycle. And then it was a crazy time, because I arrived in Kathmandu the night after 11 Nepali workers were killed in Iraq. And it was a difficult time in Nepal anyway, because it was the civil war. People were really sort of, unhappy. So when these 11 Nepalis were killed in Iraq, all of a sudden the Nepali population turned against all the Muslims. And it was crazy. They attacked the mosque in Kathmandu. They attacked Muslim shops. and we had a curfew for 5 days. So I had just arrived in Kathmandu. It was before, the time of great internet, WhatsApp. It was nothing there. And I was sitting in that hotel. I used to stay with Mike thinking, what on earth have I done? But I did have my bicycle, and 5 days later, then I went to see Miss Hawley and started interviewing teams.
Yeah. And so tell us a bit more about the book. I'm biking Kathmandu, only in German right now, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll get it translated. And I know you've done some translation yourself, so maybe you could be working on this.
Well, it's funny you should say that. Had I written a book out of my own wishes, I would have written it in English, because even though my mother tongue is German, my first language is English. I live my life in English.
Yeah.
But I was approached by an Austrian publisher.
Right.
And I didn't want to write a book. So I said, oh, no, thank you very much. I think I have to live a little bit longer and experience more to write a book. But they were of a different opinion. So I did write the book in German. It only took 6 months. And the reason why we called it I Have a Bike in Kathmandu is really because it's not really a mountaineering book. It's a lot about Miss Hawley, a lot about, my life with her, a little bit about myself, but also, the encounters with people. Also about my humanitarian work. So it's interesting, 19 and 90-year-olds read the book. It's very simple. There's no big language. And yeah, I mean, now in hindsight, I'm glad I've got it. And only recently, so I've been in touch with the mountaineers in the US, and Bernadette McDonald's written quite a lot of books for them. I've translated 3 books for them, but unfortunately, they don't want it, which I, in a way, I understand. I'm a no-name in the States. Maybe I'll have to live to 85 like Miss Hawley to have it published in English. But I mean, maybe there will. I mean, at the moment, I've put it on the back burner, but there will be a translation, and I'll translate it myself. Let's see. I mean, I just thought I'm just going to start and see how it goes.
Yeah, well, I for one will get one as soon as it's translated, and I know there's a ton of other people like me who have had amazing experiences with you in Nepal over the years, and I'm sure they would all love to get a copy of it as well. But you mentioned your humanitarian work, so just tell us a bit about that.
Yes, so when I was living in Switzerland, just before I went to Nepal, I was working as a journalist, and I interviewed the delegate for Swiss humanitarian aid, which is part of the Swiss Foreign Ministry. And after the interview, again, my curiosity, just does humanitarian aid work? Do they need journalists? Thinking of, expecting the guy to say, no, what will we need journalists for? But anyway, he said, yes, actually, you can apply here. He actually asked me to send him my CV, and then it was a long application process. And now I have been in the Swiss Humanitarian Aid Unit since 2006. And basically, I always say the Swiss, they have the humanitarian aid, they have buckets, a bucket full of doctors and nurses and water engineers, and a tiny bucket with journalists. And if there is a crisis somewhere, let's say an earthquake or a flood or wildfires, they often send a team, a so-called rapid response team, like everybody, the Canadians do, the Americans do, the English do. So they often, they send a team, and often they send a journalist with them, to handle the media, to do all the reporting. But then, it's when you go to an emergency, you do everything. I mean, I remember I was on Lesbos. It was during COVID, when the big refugee camp went up in flames, and 10,000 people who had been homeless anyway were homeless again. And yeah, so you get a phone call. I was in the middle of a cycling holiday. Billy, can you be in Bern tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock? I was there with my sister. She checked trains. I arrived in my cycling gear, but you get kitted out, you get everything, and off you go. Yeah. And then you do everything, you report. I mean, I was in Lesbos. I was at the water point, trying to sort of, control the crowds because people really needed water. So, but it's a beautiful, I'm very, very, very grateful that I do this work, because it gets me to speak to people, and it gets me to find out, what's really happening inside them. And yeah, we get upset, too many refugees, and I can tell you, I was speaking to a lot of people, and none of them left their home easily. really. And it's just they live in such dire conditions. And we are very lucky. So I'm very grateful to this work.
Yeah, well, and I'm grateful for people like you who make sacrifices in your life to help all these other people in need. So that's amazing. And we will get to leadership and team building at some point, but there's just so many neat things to talk about with you, Billy. And so, but I want to start to move into Everest here because you're so connected with Everest. You chronicle every season. I'd really be negligent if I didn't ask you a few questions about this most recent Everest season. So. Can you share with us something from this spring season? So it just happened a few months ago here that that delighted you, something that you think was amazing, and made you happy.
Yeah, I mean, if we only look at Everest, I mean, I think now the climbs on Everest, or the people who climb Everest, they've really changed over the last 20 years, and it's been very commercial. There's a lot of people who don't really have so much mountaineering experience, but there is still, there are still great guys out there. And I met this Polish guy who climbed Everest and Lhotse. Lhotse is the fourth highest mountain, and it's right next to Everest, within 48 hours without supplemental oxygen. And that's never been done. And that really, I just thought, brilliant. Because now a lot of people, they climb Everest and Lhotse within 20 hours, but they do it with supplemental oxygen. And it makes such a huge difference. And to do that without supplemental oxygen, without Sherpa, took my hat off, made me happy. So you still have some good people there where you to think, wow, there was a joy to meet him.
Yeah. And then, kind of conversely to that, is there anything that happened this past season on Everest that was sad? That kind of you're like,
well, Everest is always. I mean, there's always like everywhere in the world. There's always delight. There's always sadness. I mean, of course, this year also 8 people died. Not as many as last year. But what makes me sad is that people who climb these big mountains, and it's not only Everest, seem to have lost respect for the mountain. And that makes me sad. And it's, and again, not all of them, I don't want to, tie everyone with the same brush. But because what we see on social media, which portrays how easy it is to climb an 8,000-meter peak, people come, and for example, 3 people who died didn't have to die. There were 2 Mongolians and 1 Kenyan. And the 2 Mongolians wanted to climb Everest without Sherpa, without oxygen. They had no high altitude experience. Now we look back to 1978 when Haberle and Messner climbed Everest for the first time without O's. Up until then, everybody thought it's impossible.
Yeah.
And if you look, 7,000 people, more than 7,000 people now have climbed Mount Everest, and of those, around 240 without O's. It's only for the elite. And these people come and they think, oh, I'm going to climb Mount Everest without oxygen. I mean, it's just, and that really makes me sad that, everything seems too easy, but it happens in the Alps as well. So
yeah, people just don't take it seriously any longer. This social media has created a whole new persona of what Everest is, and it's attracting a different type of person than when I climbed Everest back in 2008. It's even changed a lot since then. It was just starting to move more into the commercialization at that point, but it's really accelerated since that time. So getting into some topics around leadership now. So you have had a lot of experience in leading expeditions or being on expeditions with leaders as well. What do you think is it that makes a great leader? What are the characteristics of a great leader, expedition leader?
It's so interesting because, again, an expedition leader on Everest, some of them are mountain guides, but some of them don't. And an Everest expedition, I think, requires more of a manager rather than a mountain guide. So I see that the classic mountain guides, they're great on the mountains. They're great on telling people what to do and how to do it. But they often, and again, not everyone, don't make the best expedition leaders because it's a management job. you are managing a team. So, and I think for a great, I mean, like for every leader, you need to know how to delegate. You need to have a good team. You know, for example, I climbed 3 of my 6 8,000-meter peaks with Russell Bryce, who I thought was a brilliant expedition leader, but he had a fantastic team. One of them was Tashi Sherpa. Russell wouldn't have been so successful, and he knows this himself, without Tashi. So a good team, a good manager, and just, you know, you have to stick to your decisions, make decisions, and of course, involve your team. But if you have a team of, let's say, 15 punters, you are the expedition leader and you make these decisions. Maybe with your Sherpas, but this is why I pay an expedition leader. And that's always often been a problem, that people then, you know, if the expedition leaders then allow all the clients to have a say, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So that's my thought on that.
Yeah. And so conversely, again, you know, you have probably seen or maybe been experienced with leaders who are not so great. What are some of the things that you think make a poor leader on an expedition?
I mean, I think you do, you know, really, you have to look after your team. You have to listen to your team, even though I just said, you know, you make the decisions, but at the end of the day, you also, you know, you have to, you know, and you mustn't. Okay, I'll answer this in one sentence. A bad expedition leader is somebody who is more focused on his own interests than in the clients. Now, I've seen it. You have guys, expedition leaders, and they want to climb Everest.
Yeah.
And they have a team of 5 people, and they focus on their climb. And if they do that, bad expedition leader.
One of the things I often talk about with Everest, and we talk about this in our leadership programs as well, is we really talk about being a servant leader. And as a servant leader, it's not about me, it's about my team. It's not about getting myself to the summit, it's about getting my team to the summit. And as a servant leader on Mount Everest means that you might not get to the top, because that's not your job to get yourself to the top. Your job is to get your team to the top. And that's really what you want in this environment, is that servant leader. So, you know, through all of the you know, interactions you've had with Everest, the Himalayan Database, you already mentioned Russell Bryce. Are there one or two other leaders who you think are great leaders and have done a really great job on Everest or these types of expeditions?
Yeah, I mean, you have, you know, I mean, you have, see, the whole environment, and we'll speak about this later, on Everest and all the other 8,000-meter peaks actually has really changed. And we've gone away from having the classic expedition leader like Russell Bryce was, like, you know, and you know, the New York, or Kerry Cobbler, you know, he was another, you know, a little bit smaller than Russell, but also he's a mountain guide himself, but also had done expeditions for so long that he was also a good manager. Then back in the days, you know, there was Dave Hahn from the US, who, you know, back then he was the Westerner, or the non-Nepali with the most ascents. The people like those who had a lot of experience at high altitude, and then you have Phil Crampton, who's not a mountain guide. And it was so funny because people laughed at Phil at the beginning when he started, because he used to run a bar in New York. Yeah. And Phil is not a mountain guide. But over the years, it was quite interesting to see that he got more and more accepted, you know, by the old guys like Russell and Henry, Todd, you know, who's also an expedition leader, because Phil was just a very good manager and he runs good expeditions. So, you know, there goes to show that, I mean, it takes more, of course, you need to know what you're doing. But as I said before, being a mountain guide doesn't necessarily mean you're a good expedition leader. So, you know, good social skills, and Phil has that.
Yeah, and we've seen that many times, right? When somebody is really, and this happens in the mountains and it happens in business environment, when somebody's really good at their job, they get promoted to a leader. But just because you're a talented climber doesn't mean you're going to be a good expedition leader.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, there's so much that comes into it. So again, now you kind of mentioned it a little bit, talking a little bit about changes on Everest. do you think the leadership has changed in the last 20 years? How has it changed? And you've alluded to this a little bit, but how has it changed?
Hugely. So when I first started working for the Himalayan Database and Liz Hawley, it was exactly 20 years ago. Oh my God, very scary. And, we had, and it was so much easier to keep track of the expeditions because you had, let's say, there was IMG, there was Russell Bryce, there was Kerry Cobbler. So you had the classic
Consultants.
adventure consultants, exactly. Alpine Ascent, Jagged Globe. I mean, and they had one expedition leader. And maybe, I mean, when I climbed Everest, we were 30 clients and 30 Sherpas. So Russell was the expedition leader, and then he had 5 guides. But anyway, so after the expedition, Liz Hawley or I would talk to Russell Bryce, and he would give us the information for 60 people. Okay, done. Whereas now, and it's not a bad development, it's just different. Over the last 10 years, the Sherpa companies have taken over, which is a good thing. We are in Nepal, and, for many, many years, the Sherpas were always in the background. And now they have really taken over the expedition business. But the problem with these expeditions is that they don't really have a leader. They have a base camp manager. But let's say there's a Nepali company, they have 120 clients on Everest. So maybe they have 3 Spaniards, they have 1 Canadian, they have 4 Germans. So this is no longer a whole expedition. Those 120 people, it's like patchwork, okay? So there is nobody really, like Russell said, okay, weather forecast, good summit date, 21st of May, we're leaving base camp on the 18th, done. It doesn't exist anymore. And I think that has become a little bit of a problem because there is no unity anymore. And then you have a lot of people who may have climbed Everest with Russell Bryce or with Kerry, and maybe they have climbed 2 8,000-meter peaks with them. And then they think, oh, I'm an autonomous mountaineer. I can do it. I just do it with a Sherpa. But, I've climbed my 6 and I would not. I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. I'm not very good at route finding. I'm not very good at, doing the weather. So I know I need an expedition leader to help me there. So, and I think that's really changed. There's still a few classics, but if you look, for example, at IMG used to have 40, 50 people on their trips. I think this year they had like 12. So, a lot has shifted to the Nepali companies. But again, a good thing because it's about time they got their piece of the pie.
It's an evolution, and the landscape of Everest is changing, right? We can't stop it. It's happening, and so how do you work with it? How do you make it work? A couple of things you mentioned there. One, you picked May 21st out of the air, which was the day that I summited Mount Everest.
Me too. So you were 2008 and I was 2009.
Yeah. 1 year apart, exactly. Yes. Very popular day. The weather tends to line up in that area around the 21st.
Yeah.
But then also you mentioned, you know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at. And one of the really important things that we don't spend a lot of time talking about, we talk about leadership a lot, but we don't talk about followership, right? There's a time when we all need to be a really good follower. And how do we become that follower, part of that team? I'm not in a leadership role, but I need to be part of this team and help this team to be successful. So, transitioning now, talking a little bit more about teams instead of leadership, let's look at teams here. And really, leaders are there to help grow and to develop teams, but you can't build a high performance team unless you know what it is, right? You have to have a definition of it. So how would you, if you think about a great team that you have been a part of in an expedition environment, how would you define a great expedition team?
I mean, it's a difficult question because, an expedition team can be small or big. And if I go back to my Everest expedition in 2009, we were 30 people plus 30 Sherpas. And the team you know, we had like 3 different mess tents. And of course, you know, you had, again, clusters of teams. Even though we were one team, we had like little bits and bobs. And I mean, I think all the teams I've been on, and I've been incredibly lucky, have been really good teams. I mean, there's always the odd one out, you know, but I think also we go to the mountains and we all have one thing in common. Maybe not now, not so much anymore, because people's motivations have changed why they go to the mountains. But that's and everybody has their good reason why they want to do it. But you know, all mountain lovers, so that gels us together already. And I think people, you know, I mean, I don't know, people need to be open, they need to help each other. And I think what's really, really important for a good team is no competition, you know, and that, you know, and we go back to the mountains. I mean, competition is no place. There's no place for competition in the big mountains. But I think if people start competing, and that again happens more and more on Everest, because, you know, record chasing. Oh my God, you know, we've seen the first Slovenian woman. Oh my God, there are 2 Slovenian women on the team. So it becomes, you know, and then that's really poisonous for the rest of the team. So, you know, I mean, I think competition is probably not a good place there.
Yeah, well, and you see this competition now with people trying to become the fastest to climb all 14 8,000-meter peaks, right? And we saw the you know the tragic results of some of that, right? People, you know, going for these records and doing
Yeah, I
things.
mean, yeah, with the 2 American girls, you know, that was so inevitable. But because I'm just preparing my keynote speech for Utah, and basically, I mean, it was so interesting because, you know, the first woman to climb the Matterhorn was Lucy Walker in 1871. But there was also, what's her name? Marie Brevoort. She was American, and she wanted to be the first on the Matterhorn. And Lucy Walker had found out somehow, I don't know, it was before internet, obviously, that she wanted to go, and she quickly, you know, went to the Matterhorn to get it. So, I mean, it's always been there.
Yeah.
And just, I know, but we've seen that being the first is when you get remembered. You know, I mean, I mentioned before Haberle and Messner. Anybody who knows about the Himalaya know these 2 people have climbed Everest, were the first ones to climb Everest without oxygen. And you know a lot about the Himalaya. Would you know who the next person was who did it?
No.
Exactly. And this person, and I want to, you know, climbed Everest without oxygen in the same year, 1978, on the 15th of October, which is cold, without oxygen. He was German, Hans Engel. Nobody knows about him.
No.
So that just goes to show it's always been the first, sadly, but yeah.
Well, it's human nature, right? You go back, you can go into, you know, talk about polar expeditions and North Pole, South Pole expeditions. So many people died trying to be the first to do it. But
Exactly.
yeah.
So,
teams. So, you know, you talk about teams of all kinds of different sizes. What would you say is your ideal? You're going into an expedition. What is your ideal team size?
oh, you know, I mean, the thing is, I love people. I love hanging out with people. So, you know, that big team with Russell at the beginning, I just thought, oh my God. But it was a good team. But I have to say, like last year, I went to Puta Hiunchuli. It's 7,129-meter peak. It's in Western Nepal. And I went with a bunch of friends, and it was great. You know, and I don't mind the commercial expeditions, and I may go on another one, you never know, because I really enjoy being with people. But, you know, sort of among friends, and I really enjoyed it. So, you know, there was, how many were we? 7. 3 couples and me. I was the opposite, but it was great. So, you know, I mean, I think small teams are nice. I mean, also my last few 8,000-meter peaks, I climbed with teams of 5 or 6 people, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, I personally really like that size of team as well, 5 to 7-ish. When you look at business studies, there's been studies that look at what's the perfect team size, and in many cases they come up with the number 7. And
Yeah.
the reason why they pick 7 is that 7 gives you enough people that you've got diversity, you've got experience, you've got hands to do the jobs, but it's not so many people that it becomes overly complex with communication and competing objectives and so on. So 7 tends to be a very, very effective number in a business environment, but I think it also translates to an expedition environment as well.
And also you need a good mix. I think it's always important to have a woman in the team. And I mean, I've often been the only woman, and I have to say even though sometimes you say, oh, I'm special, I'm the only woman, I actually quite like having another woman on the team. But also, but then again, we have to stick together. And I think, especially with women, and there's only 12 or 13% climbing in the Himalaya in women, which, I mean, it's hugely increased. But I think we need to stick together and don't bitch about each other, because often I said, oh, she said this. Oh, no, she didn't really do that. So, and sometimes I think, there is a little bit of competition there as well. And again, we have to stick together, gel. So, I think a good mix. And I quite like also international teams if we all have a common language.
Yeah, that diversity is a huge bonus to teams. Now, you mentioned a little while ago, 8 people died on Mount Everest this season. Last season, so 2023, was it 19? 18, 19?
18 or 19, yeah.
Something like that. So, we've talked a little bit about the changes on Everest, and that it's not really teams anymore. You don't really have leadership anymore. Do you think, I know the inexperience level and volume of people are contributing to the depths, but do you think this change in philosophy or change in style or change in culture is also contributing to that?
Yeah. I mean, some of the elements I mentioned before, people often overestimate themselves because they've just climbed to 8,000ers with an expedition leader. They think, oh, I can do it. Why would I pay 80,000 with, let's say, Lukas Furtenbach, who has mountain guides and he's the expedition leader, and then if I can do it for 35,000? And then okay, you go for the cheap option. But often, and there has been a lot of criticism of the Nepali companies that they cut corners and so on and so forth. But I also think, okay, this is their way. But as a client, as a punter, I need to do my homework, and I have to think, okay, and this is what I said before, I know what I'm good at and what I'm not good at. And to this day, I would not just go, because then you sign up with a team and, for 35 or 40,000, which still seems a lot of money, but in Everest terms, it's not. And then you don't find out, oh, has your Sherpa actually climbed Everest, And we have seen inexperienced people with inexperienced Sherpas, cutting corners, and the record seeking, the overestimation, the respect people have for the mountain. And I think what it all boils down to is, I'm not saying it's social media's fault, but we read how easy it is to climb these big mountains. And Scott, sometimes people come back and they may have summited, but they say, oh my God, it was so hard. I was so surprised. And I say, well, you've just climbed the highest mountain in the world. So, I think so what happened last year, and I said it, and I know maybe I shouldn't say it publicly, but I think the level of incompetence last year reached a new level. And that was one thing. Then last year was very cold, and the weather forecast, when they, even though the weather forecasts have gotten so much better, the weather has been so fickle over the last 2 years. It's been really difficult, to predict. So, there's a lot of, cold and also the record seeking. Oh my God, they have to do it. And also some some cultures. There are some cultures, for them, they'd rather die than not make it to the summit.
Turning around is not an option.
Yeah. And I've seen it, pressure from the families, and that is also, people, they don't want to lose face, and they think, oh my God, it's such a failure if I don't make it, and they give everything. So I think it's a mixture of so many things. And also, I mean, like I mentioned before, that people don't really check, you know, how experienced is my Sherpa? Why am I only paying so and so much money? So, you know, this year, I think the weather was incredibly stable. That's why it was a better year.
Yeah. So I want to move on from our team topic in a minute, but just a last question around teams is, can you think about a story where teamwork made the difference between success and failure? This might be something that you've experienced or something you have observed. Could be on Everest, could be another mountain, but you know, teamwork made the difference between success and failure.
Oh God, yeah, that's out of my own experience.
Or something you
I
said
mean,
you've
I mean,
observed.
I do have, well, you know, sort of teamwork. It's also a little bit with leadership. I remember when I climbed Manaslu. So I climbed Manaslu twice. I wanted to climb without oxygen the first time round. And I remember when I got to Camp 2, I was so slow, Russell would open his tent, and because I was the only one who wanted to climb without hose. And Russell just said, Billy, you're supposed to impress me, not depress me, because I was so slow. So I used gas that year, and then I went back the following year without oxygen. And I remember, because I was, you know, I was not well, and I was faffing around, and then my oxygen, you know, I was fighting against the oxygen, and you know, my team was getting ready, and they're antsy to go, and I was there faffing with my oxygen mask. And in the end, the team started to move. And I was down there with Kenton Core, and good old Kenton helped me fix my oxygen mask. But I felt so detached because they had already gone, and absolutely understandable, because, you know, I was faffing around. They wanted to go. People get cold. Comes a point where I said, you know, Billy, we love you, but we go. So, and I was sort of plodding up, and you know, the team, and they were going further and further away. And I, to myself, I just thought, no, that's it. I can't, you know, I'm too detached. They're too far away. I was just about to turn around. So now that story is going to turn, and that shows now a good leader. So I think when the team falls apart, you know, I could have easily not made it to the summit.
Yeah.
So I take the radio and I say, Russell, you guys are so far ahead. I'll never catch up with you. I'm going to turn around. Russell said, Billy, you're just there. I see you. You're not that far away. Just carry on. And I did, and I made it to the summit. So that's like both, you know, the team leaving me, and very rightly so, not a complaint at all. Me thinking, I can't do it. But then Russell, as a leader, coming in saying, Billy, because he had trust and faith in me, of course, you're not that far away. Just carry on.
Yeah.
I did make it.
Yeah. So the leader can make a difference for sure, just with their words. Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about change. Change is a constant in our lives. Change is a constant in an expedition. You know, how often have you ever gone on an expedition that has gone exactly as you thought it was going to go? Right. There's always changes happening. Right. So
Absolutely.
how do you, when change happens to you, how do you deal with it? How do you respond?
You know, I think I mean, and especially I've always been with expedition leaders. So, you know, a change is, you know, the expedition leader changing his mind, saying, we're going for the summit tomorrow. No, the weather is not good enough. We're going in 5 days' time. I am very, very lucky. I'm incredibly flexible. We don't go tomorrow. Fine, I'll go in 3 days' time. But this is just my nature.
Yeah.
But there are other people who absolutely, they're so focused, and it throws them completely. You know, if you say, all right, we do this tomorrow, and we don't, we change plans. But that, how you deal with it, I really don't know, because I am incredibly lucky. But I think it's also part of my lifestyle. You know, I mean, I have a week where I sleep in a different bed every night, guest bed, of course, you know, and yeah, I, you know, for me, change it's part of my life. But I know that I think, you know, especially on expeditions, you have to be open to change. But how you teach yourself that, oh, I don't know. I think it's a lot, you know, to do with your own, you know, psyche, how you do it.
Yeah, I guess there's that. We always talk about nurture versus nature, right? And there's always going to be some people who are just born more adaptable, more flexible. It's just the way that they are. But then that is modified by our environment, and we can learn it, and we
Yeah.
can through exposure become better at adapting and becoming more flexible. If we focus on it. So, we've talked a lot about the changes on Everest from a structural leadership perspective, but there's been lots of different other changes on Everest. And can you think of a big change on Everest? It could have been regulation wise, or it could have been weather wise, it could have been tragedy wise. A big thing that's happened on Everest. And how did climbers respond to that?
But I mean, Everest has been changing, or, the expeditions on Everest. I think Everest itself probably has been changing, that it's becoming drier. And that's, part of the reason is climate change.
Yeah.
And, Everest has changed. Also, there is no more Hillary Step. You and I just still climbed the Hillary Step, but it came down in 2015. But I think that change we see on a lot of mountains in the Alps and the Himalaya, that a lot of these mountains that were pretty easy to climb 10, 15 years ago are now hardcore climbs. Island Peak, for example, has become really difficult because of climate change. So that's a big change mountain-wise. Expedition-wise, I mean, I mentioned it before, now the expedition business is in the hand of the Sherpas. Base camp. I mean, God, I went to base camp this spring for the first time in 10 years. And I was gobsmacked, how people now live at base camp. But I don't criticize it. Yeah. I mean, they all have, we have, and maybe you remember, did you climb from the north or the south?
South.
Yeah, north was 2008 was the Olympics. There was no expedition.
Yeah.
Russell used to have the white pod, and that was the state of the art. We had parties in the white pod. Oh my God, Russell's white pod, the original, was still at base camp. Hero used it, and it looked tiny. Now people have these white pods as their private personal tents. So the way how people approach Everest, the luxury, and I don't criticize it, because we have amazing, comfortable mountain huts, in the States, in Germany, in Switzerland, we have luxury. But also how people acclimatize, in a hypoxic tent. Now, I think the quickest Everest expedition was door to door from Lake Tahoe in 2 weeks to the summit, Lake Tahoe summit and back. So people don't have enough time, it's becoming more expensive with all the prep. People now fly, they are acclimatized, they fly to Kathmandu, hang out in the Marriott Hotel for 5, 6, 7, 8 days and fly back. So expedition style has, commercial expedition has completely changed. But what's still nice, and I just want to mention this, that despite, all these commercial expeditions and people now use 8 liters of oxygen a minute. We use probably 3 liters.
My regulator only went to 4 at max.
Yeah, exactly. And they offer 8. I don't know how often people actually use 8. People start Everest, they start oxygen some from base camp, now from camp 2. We started from camp 4. So, the huge changes. But by the same token, what's really important to me, and also for the Himalayan database, that there are still true mountaineers out there, who do amazing things, and not only on Everest, but on other mountains, the new routes, the new mountains. So it's still out there. But yeah.
So last topic I want to get into is resilience, because resilience is really important in all of our lives and in everything that we do. But why specifically do you think is resilience so important on an 8,000-meter peak?
Oh my God, you can't be, oh my God, where do I start? I think resilient, you have to be, you can't be, what's the right word? I can't think of that. You can't be a wussy on Everest or on a big mountain. You've got to, even though I love doing it, but even my comfort zone, which is, I don't know what, it's small, I think, or big, I don't know. You're out of your comfort zone. You lie in your sleeping bag, it's midnight. You have to get up, get into the cold, put your crampons on. By the time you put your crampons on, you're already freezing, and then you think, oh my God, I mean, I've climbed, my longest summit day was 31 hours without oxygen on Broad Peak. So you have to be resilient. And if you're not, then maybe it helps if you really enjoy it. Maybe that also helps, because I think you also have to enjoy what you do. But I think there is no, and the people, even though we say, oh my God, we're getting so much support and people are being pushed up Everest, nobody's getting carried up, I always say that. But these people who go, they are resilient, and you have to grit your teeth. And as long as you can do that and also listen to your body, that's another thing that's really important. Don't be too resilient, because if you're too resilient, then you get into trouble, because you just think, oh, it'll be fine. I've got, it's a fine line.
Yeah.
I know.
So do you think resilience is something that, again, you're born with, or is it something that you can learn or develop?
I think both. I mean, again, I'm pretty lucky that I am incredibly resilient. I don't think I learned it. I think I have it from my mother, who is incredibly resilient. But I also think part of the reason why I do what I do is also because I enjoy it. I mean, like ultra running and high altitude mountaineering, you need resilience, but you also need the joy to do it. And I think that gets you to the summit, as long as you make wise decisions. But I think maybe you can learn it. I mean, I think for the human race, stepping out of the comfort zone is really hard. And I think maybe, in small steps, maybe you can learn it every day. Step out of your comfort zone, do something that you should think, oh no, I can't do it. And that is the most amazing thing when you do it. The feeling afterwards is so great.
Yeah, it's that giving yourself, as you say, the repeated exposure to stepping outside your comfort zone, and then finding out that it's not that bad, and you make it through, and it helps you to be resilient. And then the mental part is so important.
I was just going to say that.
I have to say, you have to be physically fit to climb Mount Everest, but that's just your entry ticket to the door. Once you get there, the difference between success and failure, right? It's all up here. It's how you deal with the situation. One of the things that a saying that I have, I'm sure you are familiar with, the Buddhist saying that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional, right? It's all about how we deal with the situation, with the environment around us. So I'm going to wrap us up there. We've had a fantastic conversation. I know we can continue this for a long, long time, but we only have so much time. But it's been amazing to spend a little bit of time with you, to hear your stories, and to just spend some time chatting. So thanks for spending time. Is there anything, any last words that you would, somebody who thinking about leadership in the mountains? Any last words about advice, or just your thoughts around that topic?
I mean, I think, whether you're a leader or a punter or a climber, if you go to the mountains, and I mentioned it before, just, don't be scared of the mountain, and don't say, oh, we're gonna, in Spanish, they say we attack the mountain or we conquer the mountain. And I think the mountains are kind to us as long as we respect them, and as a leader, respect the mountain and your team, and as a team, respect the mountain and your leader. So I think it's a lot about respect on the high mountains. So I hope that people will find that respect again.
Well, great way to wrap this up. So thanks again for sharing your incredible stories. Very honored that you gave us this time to chat with us today. To the people who are listening to this, hope you enjoyed the episode today. Hope this helps to inspire you to new heights for your leadership and to really build high performance team. So we'll see you next time.